Good morning or good evening, wherever you are. I'm Reem from Tripoli, and I'm delighted to present a paper titled Authentic Orchestrations and Orchestrated Authenticity. Recent discussions in heritage studies argue against expert-exclusive conservation practices due to their authoritarian orchestrations of meanings and passive productions. Instead, the critical discourse is shifting to rethinking meanings as occurring by culture-specific constructions within what communities do with and around heritage. This call for democratization is challenging the ways in which world heritage is defined and managed by encouraging recognition of the active and subjective possibilities of it, and hence the importance of engaging local communities as attributors of values based on meanings relevant to them. However, in its seeking to understand these grassroots ways, this new field, which adopts almost exclusively a critical sociology perspective, leans heavily on cultural substructures to explain why local communities do heritage as they do. In the dominating focus on cultural factors, community ways are assumed to be authentic. However, this notion of authenticity becomes questionable once we consider the niche in the field. And that is that influences of external factors such as temporal, political, and spatial, the influence on how communities do heritage is recognized but seldom empirically studied. Further, because the new field revolves around the immateriality of heritage, spatial factors are especially overlooked. This adds to the disengagement with the practice materialism camp of the heritage field, a disengagement that is increasingly criticized. Why this is problematic is particularly evident in conflict-affected sites where practice physically interferes to protect heritage against pressing threats, but based on the decisions of experts, while inclusion of communities is limited to capacity development and awareness raising. Hence, they may contradict or obstruct local organic ways. Therefore, as more physical interventions are happening on sites, questions should be raised about how such appropriations influence the authentic ways in which lay local communities choose to relate to their legacies. This contributes to the shift towards democratization by furthering understanding on not only how people interpret heritage, but also why. To provoke that discussion, I present a case from Tripoli, capital of Libya, where current users of a Roman monument were influenced by a political Italian restoration of it in the early 20th century. To illuminate how conventional practices intervene, this paper uncovers engagements with the ruin before the restoration to foreground how heritage was authentically processed differently before it. By local ways, the Roman monumental meaning decayed through time, while other locally constructed values manifested. But then the Italian restoration destructed those manifestations to reconstruct the original colonial monumentality. So the case study is the arch of Marcus Aurelius, located in the ancient walled Medina. The arch has been focus of many research as an, I quote, outstanding symbol for Romanity, which far surpassed nearby contemporary arches in style, material, and execution, end quote. Yet, all published studies addressed it for understanding Roman planning and architecture, or the Italian conservation. There are no studies about the relation of local community with the colonial symbol. So this paper fills that gap by taking three sections in the timeline of the arch. The first main part reveals organic lay interpretations before the restoration by analyzing observations recorded in diaries of voyageurs to the Medina between the 13th and 19th centuries. The second briefly overviews the 20th century restoration, focusing on the performative spatial conditions created to orchestrate understandings and use. The last part looks at the impact of that orchestration through community users of the ruin post the 2011 uprising, when democratic liberal activism was permitted. To give context, around 7th century BC, Tripoli was founded as one of 3 Phoenician and later Roman centers of trade along the western Libyan coast, known as Tripolitania, the region of the 3 cities. In 365 AD, a destructive earthquake turned the prosperous cities to ruins before buried by desertification. But owing to Tripoli's strategic location, it survived out of the 3 as another layer of multicultural heritage emerged above, tracing patterns of ancient remains. Today, the only remaining Roman ruin in Tripoli is the Marcus Arch. During the Roman period, it was a freestanding marble quadrifrons, constructed in 163 AD in honor of Emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus on a public land. Located in front of the port, the monument was positioned at the crossroads of the Cado Maximus and Northern Decumanus, which led to the other 2 cities. Its positioning made it one of the first structures visible upon entering the city from the port. So, the northeast facade facing the harbour was made the finest so as to create a good first impression. The 2 niches on that facade were occupied by statues of the 2 emperors, thereby signifying the arch's monumental purpose to visitors. It may have been used as an entrance to the city's forum or to an adjacent temple, but Roman triumphal arches were designed for no practical function other than a confrontational positioning for a commemorative presence. While all triumphal arches were splendidly decorated to convey messages, the arch of Marcus Aurelius was, I quote, "thought by all good judges to be handsomer than any of the most celebrated in Italy." Admired for its vast conception and characteristic solidity of construction, it was considered extraordinary how its extremely large stones were raised to such height with no use of cement or fastened so well that the hand of time in its continual ravages around it has left the monument of antiquity unmolested. These historical, aesthetic, and technical qualities made it a center of attention. So travelers to Tripoli since the 13th century wrote about it, describing how, as the setting changed after the earthquake, the role of the arch transformed as it became subject to the reworking of the new inhabitants at the layer above. With its top half protruding from 3 meters of accumulated debris and sand, the arch was the focal point from which the main axes of New Tripoli extended. However, its spatial orientation was reversed, as the arch's splendid front now overlooked a wall, while its rear fronted the street. Hence, as it shifted from facing the Mediterranean harbour to opening towards the Medina, the ruin was claimed by and for the local society. Voyageur diaries record how its visible part underwent a process of integration to serve practical functions. I analysed these texts as the only source for ethnographic data revealing lay local interpretations at that period, and will discuss these in 4 categories. 1. Utilization of the ruin. The arch was first mentioned by Al-Abdari, who visited Tripoli in 1289. Revealing that the architectural modifications extended from that time, he described that the quadrifrons had a closed door. Gerard in 1685 confirmed that its 4 archways were blocked by thick walls. There are no records of when or why the arch was first utilized, but At-Tijani in 1307 was first to mention its function, then as a mosque. Several texts followed recording other uses, including mostly as a storage space, also a bar, a residence, restaurant, a shop for dried fish and spices, and finally as a cinema right before the restoration. This utilization was out of need for space in the densely populated, walled Medina within a culture that prioritized function. But the modification created territorialized ownership of the arch, hence restricting accessibility, which some voyageurs complained about. Yet its ownership alternated between rulers and regulars and natives and non-natives. So it was not referred to by name of its owners, as was the common way then. Instead, locals called it the marble storage, denoting its functional and material significance only. Therefore, the arch was not interpreted as a place with a particular Roman meaning, symbolized in a particular form. Rather, it was perceived in terms of its spatial potential. Further, its use as an insignificant storage space and other mediocre functions indicates that heritage was not monumentalized. 2. This utilization occurred at the expense of appearance. It was therefore described as, I quote, slaughter of the beautiful, where a vandal touch of ignorance turned a majestic structure into an incongruous shelter by a community lacking all appreciation for the stately memorials of a magnificent past. Also, there are no recorded observations of a concern by natives that its splendor was, quote, half buried beneath centuries of accumulated rubbish and wind-blown desert sand. And so, nestled within its compact new context, it looked like a worn old ocean rock in that incongruous tide of people and trade. Although if cleared out and cleaned and the plaster partitions removed, it would be a most picturesque and interesting monument, the locals did not seem concerned with exhibiting it picturesquely, as would have been the Western way. And so, although Tully described locals as blind to its beauties, another perspective is lack of local benefit thought in monumenting it, especially before industrialization of heritage. Besides the cultural and educational gaps which rendered the community either rejecting or oblivious to the arch's original meaning and form. And this leads to the third analysis, interpretation barriers. The commemorative meaning of the arch was lost amid the topographic and demographic transformations. Two cultural conditions distanced local lay people from interpreting innate signifiers of its Roman meaning. First, the statues that constituted part of the monument and which hinted its purpose were found buried beneath the debris during 1912 restoration. Possibly not removed by reasons of nature alone. An earlier assumption was that statues were, I quote, destroyed being contrary to their religion, end quote. This was later supported by signs of intentional mutilation identified on one of the statues by archaeologists in 1912. Whether, as Todd puts it, by the buffetings of nature or by far more cruel man, their absence as an observable part of the arch contributed to rendering its commemorative purpose obstructed to lay locals. Also, regarding other symbolic figures sculpted on it, Tully in 1783 wrote, I quote, "Those who are versed in antiquity can easily decipher them, but they are too much worn away by time for others to understand them." End quote. Second, although its purpose is inscribed in Latin on the arch's facades, there was a language barrier. For example, At-Tijani in 1307 narrates that a local faqih, Islamic jurist, therefore of educated status, has been for a time searching for someone to properly interpret the inscription when he finally found a Christian versed in that, quote, calligraphy. But according to how it was narrated to At-Tijani, the text was astonishingly misinterpreted or mispassed on, seemingly to create some cultural proximity or ownership. Because the inscription was in a language unreadable, it was attributed little value and so submitted to decay, just like the statues were removed because they were culturally irrelevant to the community. But despite barriers to its meanings, analysis of further texts revealed that locals did attribute value to the arch. Leading to the fourth category, 3 voyageurs recorded occasions where the lay community protected the arch as valued heritage. First, At-Tijani in 1307 explained that its use as a mosque at the time of his visit was for the intention of employing the respected religious status to safeguard it from, quote, some people of rank who attempted to demolish it and take its mob, end quote. Second, Gerard in 1685 mentions that, once more 3 centuries later, 2 walis, or governors, in Tripoli considered demolishing it to use its marble. In response, local fuqaha, Islamic jurists, and members of the public expressed strong opposition to the idea out of belief that demolishing the long-withstanding ruin would be a quote-unquote bad omen for Tripoli. Last, upon living in Tripoli for 10 years since 1783, Tully observed that although Europeans wanted to shed light on the arch, the locals, quote, will not permit them to disturb a stone or move a grain of sand on such an accent, and repeated messages have been sent from the castle on these occasions to warn Christians of their danger, end quote. This jealousy was out of concern of losing the arch in the same way that relics across Tripolitania were removed to Europe in what Todd describes as, quote, rapid vandalism, not only Arab but European, end quote. These occurrences indicate that locals attributed value to the arch in recognition of its historical significance. Yet there was a reordering of values, or deprioritizing of aesthetics, based on communities' cultural viewpoints and temporal and spatial needs. Also, although a colonial symbol, the arch was valued as a local legacy belonging to the place and its people, and more so to commoners than to state. So, in these ways, the ruin's spatial setting, symbols, and function were transformed per community's narratives. These conditions amidst a different cultural context contributed to decaying its commemorative purpose, as confirmed by Furlong, who stated that it was known to the Europeans as the Arch of Marcus Aurelius, in whose honor it was erected, but to the Moors as the Old Arch. Meaning, given the definition of monuments is built forms erected to confer dominant meanings on space that presents an aesthetic value as well as a political function, therefore, the arch was demonumented by locals who neither submitted to its original meaning nor placed at primary importance its aesthetic and political values. Heritage was thus engaged in ways which contradicted Western definitions of it, including the criteria that the World Heritage Convention was later based on, i.e. integrity. While none of the successive colonizers of Tripoli or local multicultural groups saw a need to restore the arch, the Italians saw political benefits in doing so, based solely on their cultural filters. Brown echoes this bias, saying, quote, one cannot be too thankful that this beautiful piece of ancient Rome has returned at last into the possession of those who are surely best fitted to guard such a treasure, end quote. This raises questions about whose heritage and whose interest does its restoration serve. Upon colonizing Libya in 1911, the Italian government bought the arch, and intending to exhibit its grandeur as a signifier of historic Italian presence, they liberated it from accumulated ground and post-Roman adaptations, as well as slicing nearby architecture despite their significance to natives, to make way for a zone of respect. The space was decided solely in proportion to the arch to give it a dominating presence. Today, entering the Medina, one is confronted by a new pathway leading to the ruin, and descending to its Roman ground level, the context is visually forgotten, and it draws bodies towards it where no particular function can be found except for the activity of admiring it. The appropriation created a space that contrasted the density of the Medina, and being the only heritage that was framed, adorned by landscape, and highlighted by spotlights, the arch was rendered a point of attraction through a performative space that orchestrated sensual and physical engagements with it. In this way, Italians remonumented the ruin to serve their political and economic interests. This appropriation influenced a change in community understandings, embodied in unprecedented uses of it, of which the most significant occurred after the 2011 uprising, once a free civil society was gained. So people were more free to act as they will. Very briefly, a social group with sense of belonging to the Medina occupied the space as a venue for mnemonic activities that aimed to advocate for protecting the old city, which state neglected and convention rejected. The arch was thus again used as a commemorative monument, however, to commemorate native Tripolitanian identity, anchored in courtyards and historical mosques, and did not, to date, make mention of the Roman ruin or that period. It was more use of the space and the location than the monument itself, but that's beyond the scope of this paper, yet highly fertile for research. Concluding, the story of the arch tells us that there are other ways that communities choose to do heritage, but also that these authentic ways can be externally influenced. Thank you.